All right, hi guys. So we're going to be doing a lecture on blood vessels. So this is going to be titled Blood Vessels. And this is actually Unit 9, Lecture 1. I'm going to write the page numbers here for you in case you're interested in reading about these as well. And there's some good pictures in the textbook too, if you're interested. And basically what blood vessels are closed circuits of tubes carrying blood to and from the heart and cells of the body. And there are 5 types we're going to talk about. So when we left school, we had just finished talking about, or started talking about, the heart, its parts, the flow of blood through it. And so when blood's leaving the heart and going to either the lungs or to the body cells, it's going to travel through these 5 types of blood vessels. So we're actually going to fold our paper, as you can see I did with mine, like in a hot dog style, and make sure that you have 3 columns. And then you're also going to need to have 4 rows. So if you look, I made my first row. It's relatively small, titled with function. My next row is like really long. It's most of the page, labeled structure. I have a tiny section labeled vocab and a small section at the bottom labeled drawing. So just make sure your structure one's nice and big and you should be fine. So those 4 different rows. And so we're going to start off with, I'm going to use color, you don't need to, just to title these, arteries and arterioles. And so we're grouping these 2 blood vessels together because when you see this like eoles, this ending here, it just means a smaller branch of something. So like when we talked about the liver, we talked about all those like hepatic portal vein, hepatic vein, and all those branches that just got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as you moved away from the heart. And so it's the same idea here. We just have smaller branches. And so we have the same structure, the same function, just a smaller version, arterioles, of these arteries. Now the job of arteries is to carry blood away from the heart. Okay, so that's its job, to carry blood away from the heart. And we talked about this before where we use like arteries start with an A, so to arterioles, away. Arteries away from the heart, whether it's going away to the heart, away from the heart to the body cells, or away from the heart to the lungs. And if you think of this, when it's leaving the heart, it's leaving the ventricles, those bottom 2 chambers of the heart, which are extremely muscular. And so the pressure going through these arteries is very high blood pressure pumping through these. And we're going to see how the structure of these arteries aligns with this high pressure. So now we can move into the structure piece. And there's 3 layers of arteries and veins as well, with the same structural pieces and the same structural makeup, but they're just slightly differing in thickness. So we can kind of transfer this over when we get to veins a little bit as well. I'm going to start from the innermost layer and move outward. So our innermost layer is called the tunica, which means layer interna. I already messed up. Intima. The tunica intima. I-N-T-I-M-A. And this is the innermost layer. I'm just going to write inner. And what it's made up of is simple squamous epithelium. This simple squamous epithelium sometimes gets named the endothelium, so it's like a bunch of cells that make up this endothelium, which then this part, the simple squamous epithelium, is surrounded by So surrounded by a layer of, I just abbreviate connective tissue with CT, so I'm going to do that here, of connective tissue, a layer of connective tissue, elastic, and collagen. And by layer, it's like a really thin membrane, just kind of holding it all together. Elasticity is very important when we have blood coming from the heart, because as those ventricles pump or as they relax and contract, we're going to have different amounts of blood pressure coming through, so the arteries need to be able to adjust so that they don't pop or anything like that. Collagen keeps them nice and strong with this high blood pressure coming through them as well. And since they're a blood vessel, they are going to have that connective tissue, that structural piece of blood vessels as well. So a couple functions that go along with these structures is that basically its job is to separate the rest of the blood vessels wall from the blood flow itself. So it's kind of that layer that's going to make sure blood doesn't get into the walls in any way. One big function of this is that it secretes biochemicals that prevent clotting, and it also has a nice smooth wall, which makes it so that blood particles that are in blood, which we'll talk about in one of the other lectures, don't get stuck on the walls. It doesn't create any blockages. So they're structured that way for a reason. So nice and smooth to create simple and easy blood flow. So that's the innermost layer. As we go out a layer, we're going to hit the tunica media. So intima, inner, media, middle. And this one is the bulk of the artery's wall, meaning it makes up most of the wall. And this one is going to be made up of smooth muscle, as we know that's involuntary muscle, and elastic and connective tissue. This tunica media is what's responsible for the stretchiness of arteries and also the sturdiness of them as well. So this layer in veins, when we get to them, is going to be much smaller because it doesn't have blood pressure pumping through it quite as heavily as the arteries. This is really unique to arteries and arterioles. They have a nice thick tunica media to help make sure that with that high blood pressure from the ventricles, nothing breaks, and we're going to have that nice stretchy elasticity. And finally, we have the tunica externa. So this is our outer layer. And this one is again going to be a thin layer of connective tissue, elastic, and collagen, kind of encasing everything. And it also is going to attach the artery to surrounding tissues. It also holds what's called the vasa vasorum, which we'll define in the vocab section down below. Before we move on to that vocab section, I want to show you a picture from the textbook that shows all this really nicely. So if we zoom in on our artery, you can see the simple squamous epithelium in the tunica interna. You can see the tunica media has a different type of cell, that smooth muscle cell, and then the tunica externa is nice and collagenous, nice and sturdy, wrapping and encasing all of it. So that's what, if you looked at a cross section of an artery, it would look like if you cut it in half. All right. So for vocab, we're going to define vasa vasorum. And we've seen this type of idea before, but basically what its job is it has capillaries running through it, and so its job is to provide blood to the walls of the artery. itself, right? So we talked about all these different types of tissues in each of the layers. If they're tissue, they're going to need oxygen to do their job, which means we're going to need some blood getting to them as well. So these vasa vasorum in the tunica externa are going to provide that blood, provide that oxygen and nutrients to keep those cells alive. All right, so before we get to the drawing, we are going to move over to the middle column. This is what we're going to label with capillaries. And capillaries are the smallest blood vessel. And they have, let's see, how do I do this? What they do is they're going to connect arterioles to venules. So arterioles are the smallest arteries and venules are going to be the smallest veins. Now the reason I colored them in purple is because it's kind of a mix of blue and red blood, because this is where we're going to have gas, waste, and nutrient exchange occurring. So instead of being this like nice sturdy tube that's kind of controlling and directing blood from the heart or to the heart, these are going to be surrounding cells, surrounding body cells. And they're always going to be found in dense networks, kind of looking like a web instead of a single tube, which are thin-walled, and they have a large surface area. And we've seen this idea before. And their job, because of this, is diffusion. Okay, so we're going to see the diffusion of gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Waste, we're going to see that moving from the blood into the kidneys or into the liver. And nutrients, which all cells need, through these really thin-walled, large surface area structures by the process of diffusion. Now, in the structure portion, I guess this could kind of go in the function portion, but in the structure portion, we're going to talk about how tissues with a higher metabolism, meaning they're doing more work and constantly needing more oxygen because they're using it up to make energy or ATP, are going to have a denser capillary network. There's going to be tons more capillaries there. And that will be things like muscle tissue, nerve tissue, and those with a lower metabolism are going to have a lighter capillary network, would be things like the epithelium. Or let's go with epidermis, the skin. Okay. Also, another structural piece is they're going to have slits in their walls in between cells. So these are going to be really small in areas where they're delivering oxygen to tissues like smooth tissue, cardiac tissue, muscle tissue, because what they're doing there is they're delivering nutrients and oxygen. And so we only want really small slits, so nothing bigger moves on through. And then when we look at other organs like the liver, the spleen, the kidneys, we're going to have nice and large slits. And the reason why is we're going to see a lot of filtering, detoxification in these areas. And so we're going to have waste flowing through as well. Sometimes things like proteins, larger structures than just oxygen and diffusion of gases. And so these are going to be a lot bigger. So in addition to nutrients and oxygen, we're going to have that waste pumping through. And we are going to leave the vocab section empty for capillaries. So move on to our last portion, veins. And they also have smaller branches, venules. And the job of veins is to do the opposite of arteries, carry blood toward the atria of the heart. Those upper chambers of the heart are going to receive the blood from veins. And I colored these in blue because now we're working with deoxygenated blood. Remember, in those body cells, once they get that oxygen that came from the heart through the arteries and arterioles to the capillaries, they're going to use it for cellular respiration, produce carbon dioxide, leave the capillaries, hop into the venules, go into the veins, and then back into the atria of the heart to be sent to the lungs and back through the body again once they're filled back up with oxygen. We use that trick that if you make the number 2, like to the heart, you get V for veins and venules. So that's our trick to remember that. Now these have 3 layers as well. The tunica intima is the innermost, the tunica media is the middle layer. And what's different about the tunica media here as opposed to in arteries is that it's poorly developed. Okay, so it's going to be a lot thinner because we're going back towards the heart. And so if you're thinking about like coming all the way from your foot all the way back up to your heart, you don't have very high blood pressure there because it got pumped from those ventricles a long time ago. And so we've slowed way down. And also we're going against gravity. And so we're not going to have that high blood pressure, pushing really at all. And then finally we have that outermost layer, the tunica externa. All right. So as I said, they have a thinner tunica media, thinner walls in general than arteries, but they are going to have a larger lumen diameter, meaning a larger space for fluid to flow through than arteries. They have more tiny, smaller window, those arteries, for that lumen, that blood to flow through. We are going to have valves in veins to keep blood from flowing backwards, just like we saw in the heart. When we're going against gravity, we don't want that blood to flow back downward. Also, veins are really important blood reservoirs. At any point in time, 65% of our blood is in our veins, and so a lot of it's just kind of kept in there. How this blood is going to move against gravity is when other muscles around the veins contract, it helps push that blood upward and back towards the heart. This is really helpful to have these blood reservoirs in times when there's like a hemorrhage, which is when a blood vessel ruptures, and you start to have that arterial blood pressure drop. And lowering of blood pressure can be dangerous, and so in order to keep it back up, that sympathetic nervous system will stimulate those veins to contract more and push that blood to keep that blood pressure back up and back to normal. So what we'll define here in the vocab section is a hemorrhage. Oh, I think it's only one. Hemorrhage. There we go. And this is, again, when we have the escape of blood from a ruptured blood vessel. And then another thing we'll define here is varicose veins. You might have heard of these. But if those valves actually become leaky, any portion of a vein or any veins in the body, then blood can flow backwards, and this will cause like a lot of buildup of blood there, and we can get swelling and pain. And it's usually because those veins have valve leakage, become twisted even, and they'll also get really enlarged. And you'll see this bluish purpley color. So I'll show you a picture of this too. You can Google it as well, but here's like a diagram. You can see that blood's flowing through this valve, and so we end up with all this backflow here. And it's really common. I mean, most women will end up having this at some point in their lifetime. Typically after the age of 50, you'll definitely get it. When you're pregnant, potentially. Varicose veins, probably not quite to that extent, but swelling, enlargement, and they are pretty painful too. So those are varicose veins. Now, to finish on up, what I want to do is go into this drawing portion. We're going to kind of connect these. So what I'm going to try and draw with you is this picture here. And so if you want to look at this one, you can pause your video and draw this yourself in the arteries, capillaries, and veins, but we'll try it together here as well. So what we want to start off with is our outline. So we're going to draw a nice big circle here in the artery section. And we want to make this branch off into a smaller branch, heading backwards, and it's going to move into the capillary section where we're going to have this nice network surrounding our cells, nice and thin and small, a large surface area, thin walls. I should have used my pencil, but this is going to be all right. All right, so pretend there's not blockages blocking this off. All directions, layering over our cells. And what you're also going to see here, and you can even draw this in if you can, is at the end of these capillaries sections, you're going to see these precapillary sphincters, which are going to open and close depending on if this tissue needs more oxygen or not. So, for example, if you just went for like a run or something, and your muscle tissue needs a lot, or your skeletal muscle tissue needs a lot of extra oxygen right now because it just used a lot, these precapillary sphincters are going to open right near those specific tissues, let tons of oxygen in, and it can kind of reroute it. Like it's the digestive system after a run wouldn't need much oxygen, those organs there, and so it can reroute it around those organs into your skeletal muscle tissues, let's say in your legs if you just ran. Same with the opposite. If you just ate, it would reroute it around your skeletal muscle tissues into your stomach, to your digestive organs that need that help too. So the capillaries have these precapillary sphincters. Maybe we should add that in the vocab up here. Capillary sphincters. Smooth muscle that encircles capillary entrances. Okay. If there's low oxygen somewhere, they're going to open. And if there's lots of oxygen somewhere, they're going to close and reroute it somewhere else. Reroute that blood somewhere else. Okay, and from those capillaries, we're going to do a nice thin tube over to another big circle. And that will be our vein. Okay, so here we can label this our arteriole. These are our capillaries. And this is our venule. Over here, we have our vein and our artery. So here's all 5 of them right there. Okay, so for both the artery and the vein, we're going to first start with our tunica externa. About equal size in each of them. And we'll label it just like that. Then we're going to go into our tunica media. Now this middle layer is going to be much thicker in our arteries than in our veins. Okay. So this is made up of that smooth muscle tissue, and again our arteries need to react to the ventricle pumping, and so it needs to be a lot thicker. And finally we have our tunica intima, a nice thin inner layer. And as you can see, we have a nice wide diameter for the lumen to pass through in our valves compared to a smaller diameter in our arteries. So more space for that blood to flow through in valves. And we also need to add in, projecting from our tunica interna, our valves, keeping that blood flow from falling backwards. The last little thing I want you to see on here is this. So it would be a great idea to copy this down. And I started with the word left ventricle. So if you remember from before, we had Love Road as our way to remember that left is oxygenated blood, the left side of the heart, and the right is deoxygenated blood. So if we're on the left ventricle, that's the bottom chamber of the heart that's going to pump blood to the body or to the lungs. So pretty far, nice and muscular. It's going to pump blood into the arteries. From the arteries, which go away from the heart, we're going to go into those smaller branches, the arterioles, which then branch into our really thin capillary network where gas exchange will occur. We're going to have oxygen leave the blood, carbon dioxide enter the blood, which will then take that deoxygenated blood into the venules, the small branches of veins. These larger veins are going to take the blood all the way back to the right side of the heart because the right side of the heart deals with deoxygenated blood. We always go to the upper chamber of the heart first, so the atrium, then down to the right ventricle. And we are going to go through these blood vessels again to get to the lungs where gas exchange will again happen. We're going to go through those blood vessels again to leave the lungs, go back to the left side of the heart. Now that we have that blood all nice and oxygenated, we're going to go to that upper chamber, the left atria, and then back through the cycle again. And that is the path of blood through those blood vessels to and from the heart.